Was I expecting a survival horror movie about Dracula this year? No. Am I glad that we got one? Yeah.
I want to kill the cursed thing.
He is on this ship, which means that we will never leave it.
The devil is real. May God have mercy on us all.
And today we have the last voyage of the Demeter. But I guess you can just call it Demeter. You know, Demeter. I don't think there's any film called Demeter out there, so just stick with that, sure. The trailer dropped online and I saw a bunch of faces that I recognized, and the mood, the vibe of the film, the horror elements, Dracula and all this. I mean, I was not sure how it was gonna go, but I was definitely in. There's a lot to talk about, but I'm gonna try to condense it and give you my thoughts. And I'm not gonna lie, I have different feelings now, like a couple days later, as opposed to when I actually went to go see the movie and walking out of the movie. So I've been stewing on it, collecting more information, more research, thinking on it more, and I'm not even gonna lie, my review of this film has changed from what I thought it was gonna be to what it is now, so I'm glad I waited before putting out a review. So, Last Voyage of the Demeter. Interesting idea for a film that I wouldn't have thought about, because even in the titles of, like, the credits of the film, as the film is starting, it's like, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, based off of the captain's log from the book of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Full disclosure, although I really like Dracula, I love vampire stuff. It's implicit with horror. Like, I do like vampire content. I'm more of a, Midnight Mass kind of guy, but apparently there's a section in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I think you kind of see it in Nosferatu back in the day when he's like getting off the ship as they get to London and all that. There's a section where the boat transporting Dracula from, Romania to London, I forget the exact ports and all that, but canonically speaking, there's the ship called the Demeter that they unknowingly transported Dracula to, I almost said to the States, to London. And in the book, there's a captain's log that's referenced where the people that are on the ship Demeter are like discover this or like go mad or are trying to survive and figure all this out. And from what I understand, there's not a whole lot of captain's log to go off of, but evidently a director and some writers were like, let's take that and make it into a movie. Which I think is a good idea, because it's one of those things where, you can stay true to the obvious source material of Dracula, the Dracula lore, vampire, and you have some characters you can kind of extrapolate from, but a lot of it's going to be adaptation and creative liberties, because it's a story that the very general outline of it exists, but there's a lot of room to work with in terms of how you tell it, what characters do what changes are you going to make. So I always like when stories like that are told based off of a little bit of information that exists, because it really lets you kind of flex those creative chops and try to figure out a way to tell the story. Director, I didn't realize this till after I saw it, but the director is a Norwegian filmmaker by the name of Andre Overdahl. If I'm saying it, I kept trying to look up pronunciation. I think it is Andre, got that. I think it's Overdahl. I didn't realize actually how much I like this director's body of work. He did one of my favorite sleeper hits that none of you, every time that I bring it up, most people have no idea what I'm talking about here. And this movie, I would say, inspired that game that YouTube went crazy for last year. I think the mortuary's the mortuary assistant, the mortician's assistant, whatever. Autopsy of Jane Doe. I will stand by this. I love this movie. I love how it's done. The storytelling, the pacing, the scares, the creeps, the mystery. The same guy who did Demeter did this. And I always recommend this. I'm always down for a rewatch of the Autopsy of Jane Doe. So, plus, I didn't realize this, but since I'm finally watching Succession, I didn't realize that Brian Cox, old Logan Roy here. He also did a movie that I wasn't sure how I felt about it first, but I also got an appreciation for over time. But Andre here directed the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark adaptation of adapting a book to a film. And at first I wasn't sure how to feel, and then the more that I watched it, I realized that for a PG-13 horror movie adapting a kid's young adult horror book series of short stories back in the day, he was able to keep the horrific elements while still making it PG-13, which is impressive. Not to mention the actors. So main lead of the film, you could argue he's the lead of the film. I don't know if he's one of the top billed cast necessarily, but we have Corey Hawkins. He plays the lead. I would say he plays the lead. You might know him, evidently, Dr. Dre from Straight Outta Compton. But from a movie that I reviewed, I didn't cover his character, but I did review it. He was also Benny from In the Heights. Now, the two main people that you probably saw in this trailer, one I know you'll almost undoubtedly recognize, but this guy's been the mast of this, the figurehead of the marketing for this film, Liam Cunningham, who, without a doubt, has got all of his fame from Game of Thrones, as he was Davos Seaworth, who was, one of those fan favorite characters. And then, one of my personal favorites, I brought him up most recently in my review for The Boogeyman, but I talk about him whenever there's a movie and he's in it. David Dastmalchian. I don't know what it is. He just has a certain reverence for art and for horror and cinema and geekdom in general, but he's very much a character actor, and he's one of those actors where the more you dig into what he's done in the past, it's one of those, oh, he was in this, oh, he was in, oh my god, he was so-and-so, he's one of the leading roles in this. He's not the lead, but he's one of the leading roles. But we gotta get into the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. So when I first walked out of the last voyage of the Demeter, I didn't love it. I liked it, but I was like, okay, that had some really great moments, and I really enjoyed that, but I felt like it could have been better. My friends told me about some behind the scenes, and I started doing some research into it. By research, I mean like a few videos of behind the scenes, and the appreciation has been growing. For me, going into a film like this, there's going to be, as I always preface a lot of my reviews by saying this, there is an inherent bias, because I love horror. Horror, and more specifically, I don't know what it is, but survival horror is one of my favorite genres of film. I love seeing survival horror, preferably done very well. It's always entertaining, engaging. Maybe it's because since anybody could die, there's always a sense of stakes to it. And with Dracula, there's plenty to draw on. I mean, I have some friends that are way more into like Dracula stuff than I am, but I do, like I said, with Between Midnight Mass, or hell, you give me Castlevania, or older content. I do like vampire content. It's great. It usually lends itself to be these dark, twisted, oftentimes erotic stories. And of course, with an R rating, you get bloody, gory, violence, you get really dark, depraved stuff. All the actors and the acting in this film, fantastic. We're not going to see anybody nominated for an Academy Award here, but I will say that everybody, they were in it. They were in it. You can tell, but both in the behind the scenes for the movie, as well as just their performances in the movie. Even if it's an ancillary character, a background character, nobody was phoning it in. Like, all the actors were just acting it up. There's, just a bunch of serious, rough and gruff dudes that are trying to get a job done, and then as this evil presents itself, they're all faced with their own, oh, we don't believe in this, but we gotta believe in what we're seeing right now, right? And the survival starts kicking in, and the horror elements of it. It all works. The actors do a great job. It was great. They all embodied their characters very well. It's usually nice to get a horror film like this that has an R rating, and this does have an R rating. When the moment calls for blood and gore, they don't really shy away from that. There is plenty of blood. There are some gory moments. Almost not as much as I thought there would have been for a film like this, but now you got people being burned alive, you got throats being ripped out, bad third-degree burns, of course you have feeding and blood and all this, so I think the only reason the film is rated R is for just the strong violence, so it reassured me going into it knowing that it was going to be quite a violent film. One of the pros for this film as well that became an even larger pro once I learned more and I got more context for it. For one, this film's use of practical effects, but then also set design and the amount of effort and work that went into making this film. So the practical effects for sure. You see Dracula in this film. I think there's only a few shots that they had to go digitally because, you have a digital vampire demon type of creature flying across the screen, which you can only do so well with practical effects. But I saw behind the scenes and the makeup they had for this and the prosthetic and the suit, the actor, the fact they had an actor portraying Dracula. Bravo. It looks really good. It's meant to and looks very inhuman, very like this much like demonic, like underworldly, like almost a less of a man, more of a creature. I think somebody made a slight comparison for this movie to like Alien, only in that the actual threat is always hiding in the shadows and only comes out to strike here and there. The character design also tying into like the thematic story narrative elements. Dracula, technically when not at full power, is this frail creature that has to kind of like employ guerrilla warfare and like fight from the shadows out of desperation and hunger and all this. That, combined with the aesthetic of the ship and the fact that, unless I'm mistaken, this film took a long time to make, and I believe they built this ship from the ground up, and a surprising amount of this, what goes on in the film, it's all like a ship that's actually being like filmed in like I don't know if it's on a body of water or like in a tank of water, but I saw the videos. They're just shooting water at this thing. They're actually getting these shots like as close to being out at sea as they could be. So the atmosphere is like nailed down. This like in the bowels of this dark, wet, like just unstable, just claustrophobic ship, or even out on the deck, like you're not even safe up there as the rain's pouring down and there's a creature moving in the darkness of night, only illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning or something like that. The effort that went in both the prosthetics of Dracula, most I think of the kills and violence, it's their practical makeup effects, you know, throats being ripped out or bites or, you know, blood or feeding, or practical effects always earn at least one full star or point in my catalog. So I wanted to really like this film. I wanted it to be a sleeper hit of the year. Just one of those films where you hear about it, but you didn't hear too much about it, and you go see it and you love it, something like that. I think the fact that it's like a big Hollywood blockbuster, like horror film, I'm sure it helped with funding, and I'm sure it helped, with resources and connections, actors, from like a monetary standpoint, but the film's narrative beats do feel, for the most part, they feel a tad predictable, unfortunately. And there are plenty of horror tropes that we trod upon in this film. I will admit, there are some moments, I don't want to spoil it, but there are some moments where I was like, oh, well, surely this character can't die. And I'm like, oh my god, this character did die. Okay. But in terms of just the way you line up for a jump scare in typical Hollywood fashion is you either crank it up slowly and then boom, or you crank it up and you're like, and there's no scare there. Turn around, scare. It's tropey. And what's funny, I'm pretty confident in saying that it was like a Hollywood studio executive making notes for the production, because when I watched the behind the scenes of Talk to Me and the Philippou brothers, they mentioned that the reason why they didn't get a big studio to pick it up at first and why it took longer and eventually they went to A24 is because the creative notes that the big companies kept giving them clashed with their artistic ideas and overall the integrity of their film. So they rejected the big studios and waited until they could sell it to a studio that would just let them do what they wanted to do and get their vision off the ground. I'm sure that Andre had a very particular goal in mind for this film, and for the most part he accomplished that. But I think in terms of like characters, writing, horror tropes, jump scares, and all this, there's probably some boxes the studio execs are like, well, we gotta make The Conjuring, we got Insidious to work with, The Nun's coming out, that's gonna be a very unique horror film right there. And so they probably ran into that same issue, because it does have that like kind of sort of Hollywood feel. I like a horror film that, even if it is produced by a big studio, it doesn't have that like Hollywood feel to it. I mean, there's some Hollywood classic horror that has been done well in the past, but I like mine, not necessarily grindhouse, but I like mine that feels like, oh, this is a vision, this is an artistic vision accomplished and brought to life here. End of the day, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a film that I went into with cautiously optimistic expectations. I think IGN had mostly favorable opinions on it. I know most of the critics online in general have not had very favorable thoughts on it. When I first watched it, I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. And I was going to give it like an above average rating. But the more that I look into what went into this, the creativity, the passion, it played on my personal cinematic and horror biases, and I started to recontextualize the film from how it was made, the effort put in, and after more consideration, it's a film not only that I would like to watch again, I think it'd be a fun time, but it's earned its new rating in my mind. The effort and quality that went into making this film almost kind of outweighs my enjoyment of it. I really enjoyed the film, I just didn't love it, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say this film did accomplish what it set out to do in terms of what I like in a film, in terms of practical effects, production value, horror, survival horror, Dracula, vampire, even the time period, the characters, the act, like all of that. This actually is a film of substantial quality, and I can't deny that. I would definitely give Demeter, the last voyage of the Demeter, a low 4 out of 5. I think a low 4 out of 5 is a fair rating for this film. It's worth seeing in theaters, it's a fun time. If you're not a big horror person or Dracula or like vampire fan, then you might want to skip this one. I don't think it's going to hit my top 10 for the year, but I really enjoyed it, and the more that I learn about it, and the more that I do research into it, the more that I appreciate the film. So yeah, that's Last Voyage of the Demeter. Worth a shot if you like to go into horror films. And was it as good as Talk to Me? Not in my opinion, but that's for very complicated reasons to get into. There's predictable tropey Hollywood feel to it. Plus it does do that trope that I don't like, where it's like, oh, we're going to show you what happened to the ship at the beginning of the film, and you're going to be like, I wonder how we got here. And then the film is going to lead up to that. I don't like that trope. I think very few properties can do that trope and get away with it. Thank you guys and gals so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next episode of whatever movie I review, and goodbye, travelers.